a summer night, soldiers passing by, listening to the wind of change.
Hello and welcome to this discussion on the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is one of a series of programs that we're doing on events that surrounded the end of the Cold War back in 1989. This series is being brought to you by the Department of History, as well as the American Democracy Project and the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics. Our guests today are Suin Roberts from International Language and Culture Studies, Lee Roberts, also from International Language and Culture Studies, and Ann Livschiz from the Department of History. They all happen to be assistant professors here at IPFW and do a fine job teaching classes. Well, this is being recorded by CATV, as they all are. We always like to thank CATV for doing that, making it available to people on television, and then also through MDON. We're going to start very quickly. The fall of the Berlin Wall could be argued that actually began at the end of World War II. We saw an interesting alliance of groups come together to fight Germany, but then at the end, they suddenly had a disagreement about what should actually happen.
Well, a good place to start, I mean, we can start very far back, but for the purposes of the economy of time, we can start with the Potsdam Conference. So the war is over, the war in Europe is over, and the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union come together essentially to decide what the future of Europe, the future of the world, and the future of Germany is going to look like. And there are a number of different things, of course, on the agenda, the discussion, and for our purposes, the most important one, of course, is the future of Germany. And so there are a couple of things that the Allies agree on. They agree that the procedure for Germany is going to focus on issues like demilitarization, denazification, and democratization. This is also where we see a new Germany emerge geographically. The agreements make adjustments in the border of Germany, but they also divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation. And you can see that on the map, the British, American, French, and Soviet zones of occupation, with Berlin, which is located on in the Soviet zone, also divided into 4 sort of subzones of occupation.
Yeah, and actually the map up there, you can see little sprinkles of color where Berlin is, showing the other occupation.
And a little drop of Berlin in the sea of pink on your map for East Germany. The other important thing to note about the agreements reached at the conference, this is also where decisions about reparations are made. This is where decisions about borders are made. But also, what's important to note is that ultimately this is not the decisive conference. And this is one of the things that probably differentiates World War II from World War I, where you don't have one meeting where all the questions get settled. Ultimately, the future of Europe, and for our purposes, the future of Germany, really remained became a work in progress. And as a result, it became subject to agreements and disagreements on the part of first the victorious Allies, but ultimately on the part of the Soviet Union and United States. So the relationship between those 2 superpowers played a very important role in what Germany was going to look like.
So if we can have England and France and the United States agreeing on what should happen reconstruction-wise, why weren't the Soviets included in this plan?
Well, this goes back to one of the first things that you said about the strange alliance, the so-called strange alliance during the war, an alliance that brought together such different political systems, economic systems, for the common goal of defeating Nazi Germany. Once Nazi Germany was defeated, the wartime unity was gone, almost immediately after the war, there were just too many differences for the powers to overcome. And what's remarkable is that, I mean, ultimately, the United States and Great Britain found that the Soviet Union was fairly cooperative when it came down to issues of discussing punitive measures against Germany. They were far less cooperative when it came time to discuss more constructive measures about what Germany was really going to look like. And part of the big question was going to be, well, will Germany be unified or not? And what's remarkable, and I think that this is something that perhaps gets overlooked, is that the Soviet Union continually talked about, when I say Soviet Union, I mean Stalin, continually talked about the fact that the Soviet Union wanted a unified Germany. Now, they wanted a unified Germany in large part because West Germany, the territory at this point, it's not West Germany. The territories under British, American, and French control were the territories where most of the industry was located. So Stalin was very much concerned that if the separation was going to proceed according to the map as to the zones, that this would put the Soviet zone at a distinct disadvantage. And so he continuously sort of promoted the concept of a unified Germany, and it's only when the British and the American and the French came together and started, and it's essentially created a West Germany that Stalin responded by taking steps to create an East Germany to counterbalance him. And just the last thing I'll say is that his commitment to trying to keep Germany unified, again, for his own strategic purposes, he really kept the reins on the German communists in East Germany from allowing them to really sort of go full speed ahead on the different transformations. It's only in 1952 that finally the leader of the German Communist Party is allowed to pronounce that they're going to start building socialism. Until that point, there's still talk about commitment to anti-fascist democratic processes instead.
And so in some respects, what he was looking for was actually kind of reasonable. The better territory was not in his hands, and that's what he was trying to get. Now, we have clearly a philosophical difference in how the countries should be run. I would imagine that there were people living in each part of Germany who thought that the other was maybe the correct way for things to run. So what were migration patterns like in the, say, 1940s, 50s, and 60s between the two Germanys?
You can. There are various numbers on this question, so you have to kind of find somewhere in between when answering how many exactly were involved. Between 1945 and 61, though, an estimated 2 to 3.5 million people left the Soviet zone, often via West Berlin. And it's important to point out that many people in the Eastern Bloc countries were actually unhappy in the Soviet zone, under the Soviet occupation, however you want to term it, and wanted and actually desired independence. From 1950 to 53, hundreds of thousands were actually leaving coming into the West every day. I would say probably an average of maybe we'll say 200,000. I'm picking that out of the air from the various numbers that I know of. And many of them were afraid of further Sovietization. Now, who were these people that were leaving? Primarily, although not exclusively, but primarily young people, often well-educated, the professionals, doctors and lawyers and teachers and the like, engineers. And what this led to was probably rightly so, a fear of brain drain. And you see that not only in what was to become East Germany. And there was actually a loss of money, if we were to say it in dollars, just as a unit that we can all understand. People speak of loss of billions of dollars, and in fact, Walter Ulbricht, who was to become the General Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party, or the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands in German, which would be part of basically the government of East Germany, spoke of somewhere around 17, 20, something like that, $1 billion was what they lost.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, but it's not just the money, though. You mentioned that group of people that every society is afraid of losing, and those are young, educated people.
Right.
When you start to see that sort of pattern developing, even today, we try to develop plans for dealing with that. So, Suin, were there plans for trying to stem that flow of young, educated people out of East Germany?
Well, there was one plan. I mean, Leody has mentioned how many people left, especially leading up in the 1950s. Hundreds of thousands of people were leaving, and that called for drastic measures. So Walter Ulbricht, Lee has already mentioned his name, General Secretary of the SED, on August 12th, 1961, actually signed the order that the border was to be closed and a wall was to be erected, even though 2 months before that, on June 15th, he had mentioned in an international press conference that no one had the intention to erect a wall. Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer zu errichten. And he said that to calm people down and just pretend that nothing was going on. But in fact, on the night from the 12th to the 13th, at midnight, police officers and guardmen were sent out, and they erected a barbed wire fence. And when I talk about this in my German classes, and I ask my students, why at midnight? That's just that's not normal work hours. And why not at 10 in the morning? And of course, this was to prevent people from leaving even more so. In the beginning, we know this was a barbed wire fence, and then later, a few days later, they actually started putting down concrete. And we all know that the wall itself was built in stages. This was just that was the immediate attempt by the SED to kind of stem that flow of immigrants or emigrants.
And we have a photo that will come up in just a second here that shows two of the people we've been mentioning so far, so we can actually get a visual of who they are. Then we also have some photos that show barbed wire in front of the Brandenburg Gate, actually, and then also actual construction of it. But Anne, how many versions of the wall were there? Obviously, I mean, barbed wire is different than a wall, and a wall is not going to stop too many people. So,
well, before I talk about the walls, I just wanted to, as a Soviet historian, I wanted to interject sort of the Soviet role in the wall, because once the situation was in place where you had two Germanys, East Germany and West Germany, in some ways, even though ostensibly both sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, we're talking about their commitment to unified Germany. In some ways, divided Germany was a perfect social experiment. I mean, this is it. In the context of the global Cold War competition and the efforts to demonstrate that their specific ideology and the respective ideology and way of life was superior, having this perfect social experiment of Germans on both sides would showcase which Germany was going to work best. And certainly for somebody like Stalin and then later for Khrushchev, they really saw Berlin as a particularly sensitive aspect of it. There's a great quote by Khrushchev where he talked about Berlin, that Berlin is like the testicles of the West. Every time I want the West to scream, I squeeze on Berlin. And so he said this in the late 1950s, and certainly by the early 60s, the situation between the United States and the Soviet Union gets progressively worse, and Berlin becomes such an important point. And so added to all the problems experienced in Germany as a result of the brain drain. I mean, for Khrushchev, in some ways, I mean, certainly this is a German matter as well, but in many ways it became a point for Khrushchev to really to demonstrate his resolution. And so the order, I mean, it was recently discovered that the order to build the wall actually came from Khrushchev. And when Ulbricht talked about potentially announcing it, Khrushchev said, of course you can't announce it ahead of time. You can announce it ahead of time, you know. I mean, he didn't say that, of course, but basically people would really, really leave. And so the order came from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sent supplies and trained personnel to actually put up the wall. And so the initial wall, the Soviets are not that good at building, so they closed the borders. But ultimately, there were 4 different walls built. There was in the 60s.
And actually, for just a second, can we have the photo of the two gentlemen again come up again, and then Anne can educate everybody who we're looking at there.
Well, the Khrushchev is the one in the black suit, and you can see him happily and smiling. The picture is actually from 1963, so in a sense, certainly Khrushchev feels a sense of accomplishment as far as having been able to demonstrate his resolution to the world. Because in the end, the wall stayed. The United States was not happy. It protested. Lots of people were not happy, including, and as both Lee and Suin are going to talk more about, the Germans themselves. But as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, it accomplished in the short run what needed to be accomplished. Mm-hmm. The brain drain was gone. The Soviet Union demonstrated that they were committed to making sure that things were going to go according to the way that they wanted to go. And so in the end, but to go back to your earlier question, 4 different versions of the wall, sort of bigger and stronger in the 60s and 70s, sort of continually updating it to make sure that it accomplished what it needed to accomplish.
Okay, good. And if we can see those slides up there on the screen, please, so people can see first of all, the one that will come up first is a map that shows actually a wall, the wall, built all the way around West Berlin, and we have another map later on that shows an interesting interpretation of Berlin, and then after that we'll see a slide of the barbed wire going up. Actually, it's already up. It's not going up, but the next slide will have barbed wire, and then construction itself, and then yet another one that shows what the final configuration of the wall was like in terms of no man's land and then wall on each side. There you can see the folks doing the construction. That's the one that shows the schematic of the wall itself. You notice in the middle of that there's a tower from which people can watch what's happening and be aware of people who are perhaps trying to escape. And then the last one which is actually a very recent photo, but to the right side you can see one of those towers still. And I want people to notice all the graffiti that's painted on the wall. On one side of the wall, that would have been, of course, a perfectly wonderful thing to do. On the other side of the wall, that would have not been something you wanted to do if you wanted to live for very long. So were people still able to move back and forth between East and West Berlin, and did they have reason to move back and forth between the two after the wall went up?
Well, after the wall went up, West Germans or Westerners were still allowed to go to East Germany and cross one of the checking points, and we had 8 of those, and I think most people probably have heard the name Checkpoint Charlie. And if a West German person wanted to enter, they usually had to apply for a visa, but that was probably not a problem. However, I mean, the guard posts could decide then and there, for whatever reason, that they wouldn't let you in. However, East Germans, on the other hand, were of course not allowed to leave East Berlin or East Germany. There were a few exceptions later, in later years. I think 1964 it started, that older people, people who were retired, were allowed to travel for family matters, for example, or if you had an important family event, such as a death in the family or whatever. If you could somehow prove it, you could apply for a visa, and maybe you were allowed to travel for a day or a couple of days, and you of course had to return. And then people who had to travel to the West for professional reasons, artists or truck drivers, etc., they would get those visas, but other than that, for the average East German, they were not allowed to leave. And if you think about Berlin as being this big city that worked before, and it all of a sudden it's kind of cut in the middle, there was a transit system that was, the public transit system with a really complex underground subway system that you couldn't stop at certain stations anymore because it would go through the wrong parts of town. So those became ghost stations. The trains just drove through, they didn't even stop.
Well, as we saw in one of the slides, the wall literally went all the way around. So how did the U.S. and others get supplies into West Berlin? And we have a map that will come up that will show some major transportation routes. But Anne, how did that happen? How do you physically get stuff in there?
Well, they did. In the map that's up right now, that you can see right now, it shows the routes. This was part of the negotiation. What's interesting is that the negotiations were essentially in the hands of the Soviets. It's not until 1971, sort of much later, where the Soviet Union sort of chooses to step out of the equation and forces East Germany and West Germany to work this out themselves, to somewhat unhappy situation for some. But only in 1971 is when the Berlin question was officially settled, where this access was guaranteed. Up until that point, there was always concern that if the Soviets decide to stop it, they could potentially physically stop it, sort of the reenactment of the 1948-49 Berlin airlift, kind of very dramatic and courageous moment, but nobody really wanted to see a repetition of that, certainly.
And we have an editorial cartoon that portrays the airlift. If we can have that one come up, you'll see a few leaders. You might even recognize them without us needing to tell you who they are, showing how you can get stuff to places where it's not supposed to go. And then a slide after that actually shows those checkpoints that Suin brought up a moment ago. You can see the little tiny red dots that indicate where those different checkpoints were and how you could get in and out. So, Lee, how was this all portrayed in the media, the building of the wall? Obviously, if you went to sleep one night and woke up the next morning and there was barbed wire, I know how I would react to that, but we're oftentimes subject to how it's portrayed to us. So how did countries portray this?
Well, on the East, where it probably had more importance, it was where it was actually designed. The idea was that people spoke of it as ein antifaschistischer Schutzwall is the German word, which translates to sort of an anti-fascist protective I'm trying to think of the word wall, I guess, protective wall. The wall, isn't it? Yeah. And so the idea was, at least as it was portrayed, was to keep sort of Western agents who were coming into the Eastern zone and presumably spying, keep them out and to sort of prevent them from doing further damage. Which the damage was, of course, that so many people were leaving, and there was this brain drain that was going on. On the Western side, as you might imagine, people woke up and were confused. And for many, this was merely another sort of example of sort of somewhat aggressive Soviet measures. But at least some were able to say, well, there were no shots fired, no one has been killed, so it must not be too bad just yet. They did quickly in the West come to feel that Berlin and Berliners, people of Berlin, were pawns in a war that was happening, the Cold War. And apparently, I have not read this myself, but I've read of it. One of the major periodicals in Germany spoke of Walter Ulbricht's Chinese Wall, or Great Wall of China, but it's Ulbricht's version, and then later became the Berliner Mauer, or the Berlin Wall, the Wall of the Berlin Wall, I believe we say. Yes.
And we actually have a few editorial cartoons that are going to start cycling through that you mentioned pawn, and there was a chessboard up there a moment ago, and the idea of war, obviously missiles, of course, they have wings on them. But how did the people actually living in East Germany and East Berlin, what did the wall symbolize to them?
Are we talking
Lee?
to me again?
Yeah, sorry, Lee.
I'm sorry, say the question again.
What did the wall symbolize to the people who were there? You told us how the media portrayed it, but the folks who were living there, what did it symbolize?
Well, I mean, it was a divide between two countries, or two probably ideological ways of seeing the world, and for many of them, very concretely, it was a divide in the families that they had, because families were divided. I would say one other thing, I've also read that people spoke of the eastern side eventually of, and this is kind of a shocking way of speaking, but of the concentration camp of the East, that meaning the entire East Berlin was now blocked off. So obviously suggesting that it was miserable for the people who were there.
Mm-hmm. Now, Suin, you mentioned the Underground Railroad or subway system that you literally could not stop places any longer. I'm sure this had extreme ramifications for folks who live there in terms of their everyday life, given that there was no transition period. We have a few photos that will show people looking over the wall and looking for neighbors or friends on the other side of the wall. How did people react? I mean, what was this like for them? How did it disrupt life?
Yeah, it was very tragic for most people. I mean, you could, especially in the beginning when only the barbed wire was up, you could see through it. It's not that you couldn't see through it. And you could maybe see your parents who were on the other side the night before, and you couldn't walk across the wall and meet them. There are actually a lot of photos that have gone around the world. I think there's one in particular that unfortunately we don't have here, but there's this couple, it's a wedding party, and the bride is crying on her wedding day because her parents are on the other side in the East, and they weren't allowed to come over, especially in the beginning. I mean, I said later you could apply for visas and things like that. So, they were desperate, many of them, to get back together, and for most of them it wasn't possible, so they had to come up with extreme measures as well. And one of the things, I mean, we'll talk soon about probably escape attempts and things like that. There were among those people who tried to build tunnels underneath the wall, and there are, I think, about 100 in Berlin, and which you can still visit today. You can take tours and look at those tunnels, and that people dug with their own hands and trying to reunite family members.
And we actually saw a tank patrolling along the wall in the early stages, not allowing. I mean, that's a fairly imposing. You said you can see through barbed wire. Well, yeah, it's a little imposing, but when there's a tank on the other side, it's even more imposing.
Of course, yeah.
A little less likely to want to go through there. You talked about the tunnels. How many people actually tried to go over the wall? How many people actually tried to defect over the years?
Well, it's hard to say, but I think roughly the numbers, at least that I could find, was about 100,000 citizens tried to escape. 5,000 through various means, and 5,000 were successful. Roughly well, the numbers are not clear on that, but right now what I found is 138 died trying to cross the Berlin Wall. Either they were shot, maybe they were injured, some of them were left to bleed to death right at the wall. The guards weren't allowed to help them. I think one positive maybe example of the 5,000 who made it is, and people have probably seen his photo, was Konrad Schumann. He was one of the post guards, and that was the day when the wall was erected as a fenced barbed wire fence. He was the one who, he was 19 at the time. He just was standing there. He was supposed to guard the fence, but he decided I think in a last-minute decision that he was going to jump through the barbed wire. And on the other side happened to be a photographer who took a photo of him jumping through it, and that went across the world. And he was immediately picked up by a West German police car. And my students are often perplexed, and they say, well, what's going to happen to him? What are they doing? He's actually driven into safety. I mean, they were trying to help him, of course.
Well, I'd rather focus on the victories than the defeats. Of the 5,000, is there a common way they chose to do it? I mean, how many people literally jumped the wall and ran? How many people were tucked in the trunk of a car, underneath a truck? How did people succeed?
I can speak on that a little bit. The number is difficult for me to ascertain, but I can tell you that there are many ways that they attempted to escape. Among those are, for example, she just already mentioned digging tunnels. There's actually a film that's called Der Tunnel that has come out that is on this. They would apparently take hot air balloons across if the weather were right. They would slide across or along wire lines to get to the other side. And probably two of the most famous ways, the best known ways, other than the tunnel, very, very commonly known way, was to drive a car in the beginning, to drive a car right through it. And in the beginning it was easier. As the wall became more concrete, so to speak, it became more difficult. Still, people would try it. When they were able to drive through it at one point, and so the wall was built stronger. It was made actually of solid material, and the East German government built it in such a way that they reinforced it with a metal bar, so that if you were driving through, you would stop at a metal bar. Well, what happened? People modified a car so that the top of it would rip off as they were driving through, and they could lie low and make it through. And so, I mean, and then the next measure was to make roads to it, not straight, but curving and winding, so you couldn't gain enough speed to be able to get through the wall. Another way that was well known was going through the sewer system. And if you've seen the film Das Versprechen, The Promise, came out in 1995 by Margarete von Trotta, it deals with a group of people who actually leave East Berlin through the sewers. One of them, of course, as must happen, is left behind, and of course he is one of the main characters, and the woman he's about to marry escapes to the other side, and then they have this relationship that goes on, and she can come and visit him at various places, but he never gets to go to see her, and it kind of shows you that how difficult it was to leave, but then how difficult it was also to continue to have this love relationship.
We have a map that's going to come up in just a second that will actually show East Berlin, and then West Berlin is actually just yellow. It's as if there are no streets there whatsoever. I mean, it's as if it doesn't exist. And what's your interpretation of this map as someone who makes students study maps?
Well, I would say that, I mean, in many ways it captures the Soviet and by extension the East German approach to the problem. If you act like it doesn't exist and pretend that it doesn't exist, you don't actually have to deal with it. And I mean, I think that the map, I mean, both it projects the mindset of the regime, but of course also again points to the tragedy of the situation, because of course we know that people lived in that blank part of the map, but they were forced, but in East Germany, East Germans were forced to pretend as if they didn't have those family members and those former neighbors across the wall.
Yeah. Now, Suin, you talked about the people who were killed, in some instances bleeding to death. Right there we have a photo that's going to come up that's a memorial of folks, and then there's, after that, an editorial cartoon about that. Once again, how many people passed away trying to seek freedom?
Well, as far as I know, 138 people were killed right at the border. And there's actually a research group in Germany who is investigating all these cases, and there are 100 cases more to be looked at. And of course, the GDR didn't keep any files on this, or
understandably
on purpose.
so. Yeah.
But Lee, I think, did you have to?
Well, I mean, one of the things is there's no accepted number. I've read also that there are 125 confirmed victims, so these will kind of vary. But the manner in which it happened is interesting to note, and that is that, as you can probably imagine, on the Soviet side, on the East German side, people were saying that there was never a command given to shoot. However, from the beginning, border troops were permitted to shoot if they needed to make an arrest. And so if the person attempting to escape ignored, for example, a command to stop, and then ignored a warning shot, then they had the right to shoot in order to make the arrest. Now, what happened is people who would get shot would then be lying alone, and no one would be able to come rescue them for fear of their own life. One famous example is in 1962, Peter Fechter, a very young person, was shot and bled to death in full view of Western cameras, which of course then put pressure on the East to calm down. And a very, very, it's hard to measure tragedy, but it's tragic towards the end, because the wall was eventually going to dissolve, be broken down. There was another case of a man who was shot February 5th to 6th, died on the 6th, 1989, and just a handful of months later, the wall was going to come down. So. Yeah.
Well, we do have a couple of slides of two prominent figures from that era that will be shown in just a second. In the 80s, there was increasing pressure for something to happen, whether it was the wall to come down, specifically requested by one president. What do you think the greatest pressure was? What was it that finally drove the nail in the coffin, so to speak?
I think that we can probably put the pressures into two categories, external and internal. And I'll start with external. I think the important thing to note, of course, is 1985, when Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union. And from that point on, the situation it becomes a little strange, whereas Gorbachev is, and historians argue how reformist was he, but let's call him a reformer. So Gorbachev is a reformer trying to make changes and adjustment in the Soviet system, while the leaders of most of the Eastern Europe, of the members of the Eastern Bloc, are still the relics of the old way of life. And so the paradoxical situation is that the Soviet Union is actually more lenient and less hardcore than the leaders of the Eastern European countries. And East Germany, Honecker is probably one of the biggest examples of, we can say kind of one of those dinosaurs of the good old days of hardcore, hardline communist dictatorship. And so certainly the key turning points are, one, the changes in the Soviet Union and the assumptions on the part of people in Eastern Europe that similar changes and reforms are going to be taking place in their countries as well. And when they weren't taking place, unhappiness about it, but also the revocation by Gorbachev of the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine put in place by Brezhnev in the 1960s, to summarize it, this is the idea that, once you go socialist, you can't change your mind, which essentially was a way to make sure that all the countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Bloc, would remain in the Eastern Bloc by force, if necessary, by force, Soviet force or force of other members of Warsaw Pact countries. In the summer of 1989, Gorbachev basically says the Brezhnev Doctrine is no longer in effect. He says it's inadmissible for one nation to forcibly restrain sovereignty of another, and he basically is admitting that the Soviet Union cannot solve the problems in Eastern Europe. And this is a crucial turning point, because of course Gorbachev assumed that the reformers in Eastern Europe would, being good communists, would figure out a good way of dealing with all of these problems. Some have said that he replaced the Brezhnev Doctrine with the Sinatra Doctrine, right? The Eastern Europeans could now do it their way. As it turned out, it didn't go exactly according to plan, either in the Soviet Union or in the rest of Eastern Europe. When Gorbachev in October comes to East Germany, he's greeted as a hero by the people of East Germany, and he tries to tell Honecker that, he really needs to do something, he needs to democratize, he needs to change. Honecker is not particularly interested. And so those are the important external pressures. Internally, you have, on the one hand, a wave of demonstrations in East Germany and East Berlin, sort of gaining momentum through the spring and summer and fall of 1989, and the ability of East Germans, starting in the summer of '89, to get out. The border, the Austrian border with Hungary is opened up in part because Hungary is at the forefront of this democratization. And once many East Germans start to leave, more or less legally, this puts kind of additional pressure, and this is a combination of internal and external, on the government of East Germany to finally admit that the wall is more symbolic than anything else.
But it was not stopping people any longer. They were able to escape via other means. And so when we reached the point that the wall was going to be opened up, there was actually a massive chaos. Why was there chaos?
It's an interesting and actually comical story. And in response to these massive demonstrations that were going on, the SAD had decided to revise a few travel regulations. And on November 9th, 1989, Günther Schabowski, who was the GDR Central Committee member responsible for media, the press secretary, so to speak, was supposed to make this announcement in a live press conference. However, he had just been on vacation, he had just come back, and he wasn't informed correctly. He got this little note card, and he made this announcement that was essentially wrong, or in terms of that what he was supposed to say, or what the regulation was actually supposed to be, was that people were allowed to travel, but they still had to apply for visas. However, he said, when he was questioned by journalists, that he said that private trips abroad could be applied for without proof of eligibility, reasons for travel, or family ties. So this was new. This was something totally new. And he said that permission would be granted on short notice. And when he was asked, when would this go into effect, he said, well, I guess immediately. And that was at 7 p.m. It was aired also in West Germany at 8 p.m. By 9 p.m., East Germans were already showing up at those checkpoints, trying to exercise their new right to travel. And, of course, the border guards didn't know what was going on. They hadn't been informed. And people were coming up, and thousands of people, actually by midnight, or 11 p.m. midnight, 20,000 people, for example, tried to cross one checkpoint. And what are the guard posts supposed to do? They let the first ones through, and some were actually expatriated by a stamp in their passports, but they didn't know what to do. And of course, I mean, with masses of people like that, you can't prevent them from crossing. So they went to West Berlin, and that started the first few days of celebration on both sides.
So basically a bureaucratic snafu is the reason the wall came down. Is that what you're telling me?
Didn't want to say it that way, but...
we could have had this all end a long time ago if we had just had the right bureaucrat in place. I love it. We have a series of slides that are going to start showing now in just a second that are graffiti from the wall, some of which is actually pretty nice-looking art, too. Some of it, not so great. And there are expressions on the wall that people should be able to read. Many of them are in English. What does the wall symbolize today, or perhaps more accurately, how should it be remembered? And I want to hear from all three of you, but I'm in particular interested what our German professors have to say. How should that wall be remembered?
Well, having grown up in Germany during that time, before the wall, of course, and then when the wall fell, I think I was, maybe I shouldn't say how old I was during that time, but let's say I was in middle school. For me personally, the wall represents probably the hardships of individuals, of families, especially knowing all the cases where attempts to cross the wall have failed, knowing individual stories of families that have been separated through the wall during the 40 years. I think that's what will stay with me. Also knowing that even 20 years after the wall is gone, that people still talk about this, not the physical wall, but the wall in people's heads, because even though Germany is now one, people still think up to this day often in terms of East and West, Ossis and Westies, the Easterners and the Westerners. And I just recently saw an interview with high school kids who were born in 1989, 1990. And of course, they were born at a time when Germany was reunited already, and that's all they knew. And yet they still grow up with this divide in their head, that in their minds that Germany can still be divided in East and West, and that's a little bit surprising. And I wonder how many generations it's going to take to overcome this.
I graduated from high school in '89, and for me,
apparently somebody's willing to say how old
I'm willing to say. And for me, the fall of the wall was the end of the Cold War. It signaled for me huge hope for the future. And I actually got to go to Germany not long after that. I was intent on studying Russian and German, and I got to go to an international school in Germany for several months, and I was surrounded by Russians and Germans. Actually, many of the people who were from abroad were actually from Russia, and it was a big thing. We talked about the wall quite a bit, but many years later, I would say if I'm looking at it, what would it symbolize to me? To me, the wall coming down is a concrete, I keep using this word today, but it was a concrete version of this so-called raising of the Iron Curtain. Here we can see this wasn't just that now you can have a passport, or you don't even perhaps need, well, you can have a passport to get from country to country. You can go to the west, so to speak, or to the east without having to worry about getting shot. It is truly, things have changed, and you can see it in this wall, or the disappearance of it. The fragments are left to remind of it. If I can add on to what Suin just said about the differences today, this Ossi und Wessi mentality, I think it's changed a little bit, but there is still, people speak of a wall that is in the mind of the people. But there is a new thing also called Ostalgie, which is built on a word meaning east and nostalgia in one. Ost is east. Nostalgie is nostalgia in German. And there is this sort of resurgence of good, positive feelings towards the East and what it was, job security. And maybe the West did not, the Western lifestyle did not give everything to the people that they thought they were going to get by having a unified Germany. You see this in a film like Goodbye Lenin to some extent by Wolfgang Becker, which we often watch here in our classes.
A little bit of the grass is greener on the other side, in a perverse kind of way.
Right.
Yeah. And how do you think the wall should be remembered?
Well, I think, as a historian, I'll take a kind of a more geopolitical approach to it. I think that when the wall came down, there were so many other things, as we've already explored in our series, so many other things that happened in 1989 that really made it such an important year for the end of the Cold War. But the wall was such an important symbol, specifically because of the tragedy, the human tragedy involved, that was so easily demonstratable, that Lin Suin talked about. When it came down, it was very, very important. And so there's sort of two things that I want to say. One is the issues of responsibility, and this goes back to sort of viewing the fall of the wall as potentially a bureaucratic snafu, right? Something ultimately it was something so small that brought it down. Although of course it's important to note that perhaps earlier, even if crowds of people gathered, the leadership would not have felt reluctant to kill them, right? And then that's a huge change, right? By 1989, you don't want to kill a mob of people on either side, you know, east and west. It's a big...
a small step.
It's a small step. I would even say it's a medium-sized step and an important change. But the responsibility on both sides, and I don't just mean East and West Germany, but primarily on both sides of the sort of the two superpowers during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. It's important to keep in mind that both sides played an important role in creating two Germanys, not the wall itself. Although certainly the Soviets felt justified in building it, right? The spies coming in from the West. I mean, somebody had to protect, you know, put up an anti-fascist protection wall, right, to keep the East Berliners safe. But the responsibility on both sides, and hopefully it will serve as an important question of when we think about the similar problems that divide people. Certainly we don't have the Berlin Wall anymore, but there's so many other sort of points that divide people. I think that thinking about the responsibility of both participants may perhaps lead to greater dialogue. The other thing that I want to mention is that the mixed feelings, again, sort of the geopolitical aspect of the mixed feelings about the unification. It wasn't just people in Germany who had some questions. Certainly outside of Germany, there was a lot of concerns about the possibility of a unified Germany. Now, ostensibly, of course, everybody in the West was saying, oh yes, we're deeply committed to unified Germany, but that was primarily because they didn't think it was actually going to happen. Right? When the wall falls and it becomes clear that East and West are coming together, Britain and France are panicking, right? I mean, they're trying to, the leaders of France and Britain are secretly begging Gorbachev not to allow the unification to take place. Bush sends Baker to the first Bush sends Baker to East Germany to try to get them to slow the process down a little bit. And of course it's completely out of everybody's hands, and it ultimately goes through. But there's a lot of fear in Europe about what a unified Germany means, given again historical precedents for a strong Germany makes a lot of people nervous, and to a certain extent this issue of what is unified Germany's place in Europe and the world is still one that has question marks next to it. Certainly, one can say that unified Germany has not been a force for war or a force that has threatened anybody. But certainly, when we look at some of the events of the 1990s, in particular, the challenge. The genocides in Yugoslavia and the concerns about the lack of willingness on the part of European leaders to intervene in conflicts like that, with Germany being one of the countries not reluctant. It still raises these questions about sort of what is Germany's place and how does it view itself as a leader, because ultimately it will be a leader of Europe whether it wants to or not by its sheer size and economic power.
So in many respects, the question that should have been answered at the end of World War II, we're now finally 20 years later, 20 years after the end of the Cold War, finally trying to answer. We have one last slide to show, and that is actually of a former crossing point. So there have been these attempts to memorialize the wall, to remember the wall so we don't forget. Obviously, we don't want to forget our past and repeat it. But what do you think that the fall of the wall, what does that mean regarding the end of the Cold War? What's its significance regarding the end of the Cold War? I mean, is this the moment where you would say the Cold War has ended? Is that how you would look at it? Let's actually start with Lee, because you brought this up, that for you the wall was the Iron Curtain. Was this the end of the Cold War?
For me it was, but primarily because I could see it happening. Now, what was going on behind the scenes and the so-called collapse of the Soviet Union and so on and so forth, that's a much broader question. But yeah, very specifically, watching it happen, it felt to me that it was over at that point.
Mm-hmm. And Suin, as somebody who was born German, what does it mean regarding the end of the Cold War?
Well, actually, to quote Konrad Schumann, the guard who had escaped through the wire fence, he moved to Bavaria and all that and lived a happy life there. He said that in 1989, when the wall came down, that was the moment when he felt free for the first time, even though he had been freed for a while longer than that. But he said that was the first time he felt truly free.
And is it the end of the Cold War? Is that it right there? When you're teaching your class, do you say the Cold War ended? Boom.
I think I would agree with Lee that symbolically it worked so perfectly. And in many ways, I mean, you have the wall being destroyed and its pieces are being sold for high prices by new capitalists. I mean, talk about the miraculous transformation of politics and of the economy. But of course, behind the scenes, and certainly there's still a number of important things that are going on, and it's not totally over, but it certainly shows that this is a kind of the pre-Berlin Wall fall and post. It's really a different world.
And we have one more show to do anyway, so it can't be the end of
Right.
the
The next time, that will be the most
be.
important thing that happens. I think once they drag, Ceausescu through the streets,
then we'll finally say
that's when it's over.
One last question. What's the most important lesson? We have the benefit of people who study, lived there. What's the lesson to learn from building and demolishing the wall, in your opinion? If you could pick one lesson, and what would it be? What's the one lesson people should learn from this?
I would go back to my earlier point about the mutual the responsibility of all sides for various problems, and the importance of intelligent dialogue, and certainly the wall I think shows that.
Wait.
To me, it was it kind of showed that abstract differences in opinion, theoretical differences in opinion, can lead to very real outcomes that are ultimately negative, I would say.
Suin?
Yeah, that was actually really good. I don't have anything to add to that other than, that it serves as a reminder for other countries that are divided, like North and South Korea, and I know that they're thinking about their possible reunification, and it's everything that we've mentioned so far.
Well,
Mine was the most optimistic one.
Well, I want to thank all of you for participating today. They're all assistant professors here at IPFW, and that's worth remembering in case you're thinking about taking classes here. You can take history classes from Livschiz. You can take German classes from Lee Roberts and from Suin Roberts. And yes,
the last picture. I just want to say that the last picture was actually taken by a student on a trip that was directed by the two Professor Robertses. And so this is a picture that the student was in my class and gave me all the pictures that she took from their trip to Germany, including Checkpoint Charlie, which is what that last photograph was.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for watching. This was one of a series of programs on the end of the Cold War. We hope that you'll watch this and others and tell your friends about them. Check them out on CATV as well as on MDON. These shows are being brought to you by the Department of History at IPFW, as well as the American Democracy Project and the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics. Thank you for joining us.